Good afternoon, everybody. This is Luke Driscoll. I'll be facilitating today's session. I see some of the participant numbers starting to cycle up as people log on. So we'll give it about another minute before we kind of get started. And just want to thank everybody in advance for participating and look forward to a good discussion with some friends here. All right, well, I think we're just a little bit about a minute or so past the hour. And I remember we had probably about 60 or so folks registered, and I see about 30, here already. That sort of rule of thumb is usually about half or a little more than half of folks who register show up. So I'm going to assume we're together, and then whoever joins will join in. So again, my name's Luke Driscoll. Thank you for today's session calling Reemergence, Planning and Developing Vestry Leaders. So we'll look at a little bit at what we learned, over the past year or so, what we're seeing, and as well as kind of a look back, maybe some best practices and things we've learned. So eager to sort of hear from everybody. Please light up the chat as we go along. I'll be joined by a couple folks here. I'll do an introduction in a second, but also my colleague Caitlin, she'll help monitor the chat, make sure that we get everybody's question answered. And if we don't, we'll make sure to go back and answer everybody's question after the fact. So again, just introductions. I think on the next slide we have a picture of two of my favorite people. So joining us today, we have the Reverend Donald Fishburne, who I've known Donald now for probably more than 10 years now. And he is Donald, somebody you want on your speed dial. So he's been the rector at a number of different congregations and also served as associate and kind of priest in residence at a number of different congregations, kind of all over the Southeast and the South. We got to know each other through the SEEP network. So actually that's kind of how we also got to know each other, as well as he has a very active program working with clergy, working with congregations on a number of different issues. So wonderful to have Donald here today. So thank you, Donald, for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Excellent. And then I'm jealous of Donald because it's very gray and overcast kind of here in Maryland, where Dina and I are located right now, where I'm sure it's lovely down in South Carolina. Also joining us is Reverend Dina Van Clavron. Dina is a rector at St. Andrew's Church in Glenwood, Maryland, which is in Howard County, right in the central part of Maryland. We were just talking a few moments ago that being at her congregation now back since 2009. So a kind of growing congregation, a wonderful community. We actually got to know each other first working on a campaign to do a debt reduction campaign. So nothing better than being the new priest in charge and taking on a debt reduction campaign, which, by the way, was wildly successful. So way to go, Dina and volunteers.
And CCS.
Yes, well, hey, we're just here along for the ride. Also, one of the many hats that she wears is she's also the chair of the board of the Claggett Center, which is a camp and retreat and conference center in Central Maryland in Frederick, and works on a number of other different things in terms of some consulting, also doing some work with MICA here in Baltimore, which is the Maryland Institute College of Art. So thank you, Dina.
Glad to be with you.
Wonderful. And then I think the next slide is a picture of my giant pasty face. So that's just lovely. I'm a partner at CCS. I've actually started my career working with churches and congregations and parishes. And even now, after doing this for 30 years, still very much enjoy it. Giving to religion is the number one thing that people give to. It's the most personal thing that people give to. So it's something that's very near and dear to me. And I've been able to make some wonderful connections over the years. You can see some of the parishes that I've worked with. And I'm not sure if he's on the call today, but I know he was registered. And you'll see Christ in Lake St. Luke's in that little second position there. Wynn Lewis, if Wynn Lewis is on the call, I think Wynn is celebrating 40 years as a priest. So Wynn, as I told him on his Facebook page, 40 years as a great priest. So we want to congratulate him on that. So today we have a kind of a good topic to kind of tackle a little bit, to talking about Vestry, talking about how do we develop leaders on our Vestry, things that are important to know, maybe lessons learned, and maybe even also asking some questions from you in the chat feature, things perhaps you're encountering that maybe we can address. So just doing an overview, if we go to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about sort of what are some of the qualities. Now, obviously, there's many different qualities, and some people are fortunate in that they have lots of talents in lots of different areas. Some of us have strengths in one particular area more than the other. So like most things in life, balance is always nice. So when you think about what you want to have on your vestry, you want to have folks work collaboratively. You want to have folks to be thoughtful. You want folks to be innovative. It's always nice to have some devil's advocate person on who always sort of wants to object and say, well, let's talk about this. So I think if we look at that, these are some of the traits. It's not limited to this, but again, we want people who are very engaged. And part of how we do that is we manage their time effectively. So we talk very specifically about what we'd like them to do, what role we think they can play, ask them what role they think they can play. So we think that's really important. They should be representative of your congregation. So if you have an older congregation and most of your vestry is made up of younger people, you're maybe not going to be reflecting everybody's point of view. We talked about bringing different talents to the game. Also, they bring some credibility and flexibility to that role. It's nice to be able to tell the congregation, we have a number of people on the vestry. Some maybe have a background in finance, some might have a background in facilities, construction, law, accounting, whatever it might be. It's nice to have a good blend of that. Sort of the second to last thing, we want them to play nice. We want them to work collaboratively and as team members. And then the last thing is, you want your vestry to be fiscally responsible, but not overly conservative where you're harboring your growth or some of the things you need to do. But they need to be thinking sort of in the short term, but also the mid and long term. Like all of us, we're just sort of, one sort of link in the chain of a congregation that goes back probably a long time. So we want to make sure that we're kind of being good patrons of the role that we have, but we're also being thoughtful about what is going to best serve not only the congregation, but also in turn the community that we serve, the ministries that we provide. So these would be some of the things I think that hopefully capture what make for a successful vestry member. If we look at what are some of the areas of focus typically assigned to the vestry, depending where you are in the life of your congregation, you're going to have some of these things may loom higher than others. I was talking to a congregation in Maryland just earlier this week, and we were talking about how they've been able to tithe in their budget in terms of ministry, where they've been able to regularly for the past, I think they had said about 10 years or so, that they're able to have 10% of their budget that they're using directly for ministry for charitable purposes, and something they were very proud of, and it was something that sort of was the hallmark of their community. So each community is going to have sort of different pieces of this, but these are all important. So one, some sense of governance and oversight, communication. So I think this is one of the things that we learned anything over the past year. We've all gotten much better communications muscles. And somebody asked, we will provide the slides after this, as well as the recording after this to everybody. So absolutely, yours to keep. We talked about ministry. Also stewardship. Sometimes this is something that folks, we don't always have a good representation on either on the vestry, or maybe it's not fully understood by the congregation. And again, each of these things are important. How do we engage? How do we talk about them? And the last piece, finance. We need to make sure that we're building kind of sound budgets, that we're spending appropriately. We're also being fiscally sound doesn't mean ignoring deferred maintenance, because we all know if we let something go too long, what might have been a $40,000 repair turns into being a $100,000 repair. And we all know it happens not when we want it to happen. So the more we can be thoughtful about each of these things and work them out, and having a good, varied, diverse vestry will actually go a long way to making sure you're tapping into each of these key areas. If we can kind of go to the next slide, we'll talk about some questions that we think are important. And then I'd like to kind of ask Dina in a little bit some of her sort of experiences where things worked well. So I think some things when you're recruiting your vestry or when you're thinking about candidates, always stop and saying, are we being inclusive? Are we being representative of the different audiences? Are we being thoughtful that way? Are we using and maximizing people's skills to the best of their abilities? So for example, if your person who's your treasurer is a lovely person, but they're deathly afraid of sort of public speaking, don't have them be the person who's sort of forced to report out at the annual meeting in front of, maybe 100 or 200 people. So let's not do that. Let's make sure that, we're using people's skills and their abilities, and let's also kind of stretch them a little bit, try some new things now and then. When you have gaps, is that something where maybe you can sort of either meet those with a future person or even as a committee? Sometimes you can get some folks who maybe don't want to take on the responsibility of being on the vestry, but they could be a subcommittee that focuses on a particular area. The second to last one, I do want to kind of encourage orienting people properly. We see this at CCS. We work with nonprofit organizations really all across the spectrum. And one of the things I do find is there's really gaps and big differences in how people bring people aboard. How clearly do they kind of give them an understanding of what's expected of them? Spend time asking their questions and really kind of orienting them so they understand that, and maybe even having sort of a mentor or a buddy, or lack of, we come up with a different word, but somebody who's already on the vestry who can sort of help that person along. And then the last thing, I do find this is the same because CCS is a fundraising company. We always find if you use everybody's time effectively, they'll agree to come back to the next meeting. They'll agree to take on other tasks because we're being thoughtful about their time. Vestry is no different, even though they have some fairly significant responsibilities. There's no reason why some things can't happen in between meetings, and then you spend your time in the meetings really on discussion, not reviewing things. So we do find these are some things that you should think about as you're either sort of building out your vestry, or maybe you're reconstituting it, or just maybe dusting it off and thinking, hey, maybe as we kind of move forward, we could be a little more thoughtful in some of these areas. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide. Or is this may be my jumping off slide, Caitlin? Yes, I think so. We can go back one. So this is where I want to kick it off to sort of Dina and just say, in your experience, where have you seen maybe some experience of where it worked well, and maybe why did it work well?
Right. So I'm going to really focus on the pandemic here. We have about 100 and anywhere from 140 to 150 families, maybe more, that claim to be members of the congregation. Not all of those are as active as some. And so we have about, I'd say 70 to 80 pledge units a year. It's a pretty small congregation by some accounts, and large for some of you as well. And I'm the only full-time person on staff with a really great staff of part-time folks. And the vestry and the staff relationship, that's something that we have gotten really clear on in the last couple of years, how the vestry makes decisions, and then either a committee of the vestry or someone on the vestry takes the ball and runs with it, or figures out how to communicate to the right staff member, or using me to communicate to staff how we're going to work that out together. But there were some gifts on vestry that we had no idea we needed for pandemic, and I'm so grateful now. And so I want to share how great it is, because with what I'm trying to make the point of is 70 to 80 pledge units. If you're looking at pledging units and pledging households for vestry leadership, if you are only nominating folks who are regular givers or pledgers, some of our congregations have that tradition and maybe some don't. After 12 years of ministry in a place, we've gotten a lot of people onto vestry. A lot of the households have already shared one of their members for vestry leadership. And so some years we're looking around at the 40 or so households that haven't, and just trying to see if it's the right time for them to jump onto vestry. Well, I was really fried in June of 2020, like I can imagine many were, just in crisis mode and regrouping constantly, and determined to offer weekly worship and even daily worship Monday through Friday with a group of volunteers. And at one moment at a vestry meeting on Zoom, I said, I can't figure it out. I can't figure out how to do communion. I've heard of these different models. It all feels very strange to me. I don't want to have communion in front of people or send them home with baggies. You know, we were talking through all these different dynamics and what really met the theology and the particular gifts of our congregation and needs of our congregation. And I gave up. I'm not one to give up, but I gave up. I just really threw my hands up and said, I can't figure it out. I don't know if we can have communion. At which point, when I gave up, 2 members of the vestry said, okay, can we talk about this and just see what well, it didn't occur to me, but Nick on the vestry is in charge of disposal of World War II chemical weapons at an Army depot, where they bring these robot arms and pick up weapons and explode them safely somehow in bunkers. And he was the perfect person to think about contactless distribution of communion wafers, along with an epidemiologist in the congregation who's on the vestry. We did not elect them to vestry because they had these gifts, but the 2 of them talked for about, 8 or 10 minutes, and other vestry members talked about it in the field, being outdoors, worship communion. And they devised this wonderful, simple, and somewhat elegant, easy thing where I take a spoon, a nice dinner spoon, and put the right amount of wafers in somebody's hand or in a little dish they bring up for their household, and they return to their little, we call them lily pads. We paint these lily pads in the grass or use chalk on the cement for families. And they figured it out when I gave up. And similarly, in January, when it looked like we were going to have a real budget shortfall for 2021 for a couple of reasons, I took a month off and needed to do that after a year of not taking time off, and came back to find out that they'd asked the congregation to write a spiritual stimulus check. This was all they're doing. I had kind of said we did everything we could do with stewardship, and came back and they had raised the funds. And so I think to look at how you assemble a vestry, I think the most important ingredient, in addition to all these other ways of being inclusive and finding different folks that represent different interests and so forth in the congregation, is finding people who have incredible integrity, willingness to learn and grow and be creative, and that have a high level of trust, that operate within a high level of trust and understand the confidentiality, so that you can entrust things to one another and stand back and just be in awe at how people step up.
That's so true. And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of that orientation. So when folks understand, you're going to see information, you know, and sometimes whether it's donor information or know things about people who might be, you know, that are brought up that maybe need some assistance or help or ministry. So your point is so well taken, that folks understand what their role is. Just curious, we talked about what makes it work. Where, not that we always want to be positive, but where have you found where there's been some struggles, where it, you know, it didn't quite work as well as you thought? And why was that?
So I think, you know, wherever there's a little communication breakdown, or I've had a conversation with the staff and I think I've had it with the vestry, but I haven't, or I've had it with the vestry, but I didn't have it with the staff. You know, you've got, we use this model, the Claggett board and the Claggett Center use this model that I learned about from colleagues in the Diocese of Texas called EOS, this traction entrepreneurial operating system, where, you know, you have a visionary and you have an implementer. And sometimes I'm the visionary and sometimes I'm the implementer, depending on the kind of senior warden that we have and what role they take on. And I always love to see, you know, whoever is invited in to be senior warden is somebody I already trust and think the world of and want to learn alongside. And when they get in the role, I learn more about, okay, do I need to take a back seat on the vision and they take the vision forward and I implement, or do I vision and they implement? You know, you do different things on different topics. And so wherever there's been a communication breakdown has been the hardest part. And that has typically happened because I've been very concerned about burnout, not only staff burnout, but also vestry leader burnout, my own burnout. And so I haven't wanted to add more meetings to people's schedules, which would have clarified a couple of things as we were making plans to regather. So we just had to kind of back up and get everybody back on board. You know, we have we've had long-lasting arguments on the vestry, debates, dialogues, whatever you want to call it, about whether or not it's right or good to utilize any funds for online giving. And they take a percentage, whether it's whatever system you use, they're going to take a percentage. So we haven't quite had the sort of stomach for that until COVID. And then all of a sudden, when we got together, we had the stomach for it because we needed to do it. But also there's still this care for the person who's really opposed to it. Some people will really still be opposed to something like that on moral grounds. And so it takes a lot of time to circle back to people that are feeling like we've really made the wrong choice. And when you're used to collaborative work and you're used to high trust, those things that have held you back from kind of moving forward with something, suddenly when you're blasting forward, there's a little collateral damage. And so being able to circle back. The other thing that has held us back, Luke, quite frankly, is my own misunderstanding of, and I'm now really thinking more about the Claggett board. So I'll go in and out of roles here, but on the vestry, which operates as a board, of course, in ways, they worship together, theoretically, before COVID, every week. There is this bond of prayer. They know each other's families, kids, parents. They know each other. They've been there through it together. When you're working on a board like the Claggett Center, you are working with folks from around the diocese who maybe don't know each other as well. They might know names, but not anything else. And one of the places where it was really rough to get leadership up and running was when I undervalued the amount of time it takes to build relationships so that a board could really function. Now it's going great. It's off and running, but that first year of adding 3 to 5 new board members slowly throughout the year, the trust dipped and we didn't have the relationship yet. And so that was really our work for about a year.
Sure. I mean, and that's always one of those things too, where, when you have a volunteer board, like Claggett or whether it's a seminary or other types of things, there's sort of a different sense of, responsibility. Some folks strive to do that, but then also there's that sort of caretaker pride of being in the vestry locally that, I want to, make sure I'm sort of, that the congregation is in good shape, that we have some good thoughts. And the more that folks also understand, what that role is, and so we sort of demystify it. It's not sort of like the mysterious committee behind the curtain, kind of thing. Because there's a lot of people who in their lives, they've really never been invited to serve in a leadership role. And they maybe haven't sought it out. So in some cases, they might be very flattered and, maybe would be less daunted if they kind of knew what the role was and that there's a continuity where you have overlapping members. So I think even that education piece, you talk about communication, but that education piece, that whether it's at the annual meeting or even something as a newsletter where, we're sharing information with people to say, here's how we do this. Because I know all the volunteer things I've done where I've kind of served on a committee or, afterwards I was kind of pretty flattered that somebody asked me. It's always work and we always are busy, but it feels good. And then especially when things come together, you're very proud of the work that you did. I'm just curious, kind of off topic a little bit. Do you, from a cadence point of view, do you all meet, does your vestry meet monthly or do you sort of skip some months?
We maybe skip 1 month in the summer when I'm away or the month before that, because we do a lot of outreach ministry trips before COVID in July, and then I typically take August off. So we will either skip July or August, and if they meet in August, they'll meet without me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so much so, as I said, if you're using folks' time effectively, it shouldn't feel too undue because there are things that need to be addressed on a regular basis.
Right, and I really did learn from you and your CCS folks to use people's time wisely, because as much as you want to create, you need to create that space for relationship and do that in a very particular way, depending on your culture and the culture you're striving to set up. And yet it's got to also move from sort of that church fellowship coffee hour vibe into productive time, because my hope is that when the adults that are participating get off Zoom or go home after a meeting, they say, that was a good vestry meeting. And their kids hear it and say, oh, that's a good thing I'll do someday, instead of going home and saying, oh my gosh, the rector did this and this person thinks this. So, if it's a good experience, then hopefully it'll be easier to attract the next generation of vestry leaders.
Yes, you come home and your children have graduated high school after the one meeting one afternoon.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And now I want to get to Donald in a second to talk maybe about some case studies, similar to what we were talking about, some case studies of some, where things have worked well and maybe where some vestries had some longer term vision, or maybe some vestries didn't have longer term vision and should have. But maybe one more question, Dina, your way is, any sort of pitfalls? I know you mentioned communication, but any other pitfalls you think folks can avoid in terms of either bringing on the right people or coaching up folks that are there?
One thing I'm giving a lot of prayer to right now is if it is a good model to focus only on pledgers for vestry leadership. There's this fiduciary responsibility. They're making decisions about the financial well-being of the congregation. It seems logical to only select folks who are pledging, that have that kind of commitment to the congregation. I'm concerned lately, and this ties back to some other Claggett work that Luke knows about. We are considering some work before us in fundraising at Claggett, and we've made a commitment as a board to be actively anti-racist along the way. And so I'm just pausing and reflecting as a leader on some of the things that I assume are good practice that may not allow us to hear voices from folks who just were not indoctrinated into pledging the way that I was growing up in a church community, or, folks that are coming at it from different angles. If some of our ways of doing business or selecting people for leadership need to change to really be more inclusive of the kinds of offerings that people are making, while also still really asking people to make a financial commitment in some way. So that's something I am working on. I don't remember your question anymore, Luke, to be honest. I got so down that road. But I think you said pitfalls. And the other pitfall right now that I am like in the pit. Okay, so I'm not like looking in the pit, I'm like looking up out of the pit. It is this I feel like I'm in a washing machine, not a pit. I'm in a washing machine stuck on the spin cycle, and I'm spinning assessment. It has been, there was so much that we could take for granted. We'd show up on Sunday, the buildings were clean and nice, and we'd go in and we'd do the thing, and then we'd leave, and that was nice. And we might say with our staff on Wednesday staff meeting, what could we do better at worship next week? And we'd do a little feedback loop. Right now, our feedback loop is like 3 minutes because there's new data points, there's new information. And I'm constantly in this spinning assessment of, are we staffed right now for the kind of worship that we are inviting people into? Do we have the volunteers? Our infrastructure has broken down because we got rid of our cleaning service and our trash service. So what do we do now that we're going to get back to? It's like everything's under assessment and like rebuilding mode, and assessing people's pastoral needs, their emotional health, comfort with how we are planning to worship. I just heard that we're able to sing outdoors in the Diocese of Maryland. And so that's my assessment right now is I'm assessing myself. Am I comfortable having other human beings breathing out songs for Holy Week and Easter when we worship outside? And I don't know the answer to that question. So I'm very much stuck in this pitfall of, it's good to be reflective, but at some point we have to come to decision and move forward.
There's a great book called Rebuilt, and it's by a pastor here in Maryland of the Catholic persuasion, but we can be inclusive and ecumenical, right? But Father Michael White is his name, and it's called Rebuilt. And Michael was the Archbishop's secretary, so he essentially was the chief of staff to the Cardinal in Baltimore for many years. And usually that was one of those gigs. When you finished it, the boss usually gave you a fairly plum assignment. You got one of your choice of places. And I remember when he finished that job, he went to a parish. It's actually my home parish now. That was at the time a very unremarkable place. And I thought, okay, what did Michael do at the last few weeks of his job? Because this is not the good gig you're supposed to get after being on call for 24 hours a day. And so he was pastor there, and he talked about how, and a lot of folks who are on the phone or clergy or work on parish staff will sort of recognize these challenges. He said, we were doing everything at the parish to sort of focus on Monday through Friday versus focusing what happens on the weekend. And he goes, that was one of those things where he goes, I thought we should be engaging people. So we did a chicken dinner. And then people said, I didn't like how you cooked the chicken. And so he has a great book where he kind of talks about, to your point, when you feel like you're in a challenge, some of that is thinking, stopping, being thoughtful, and again, reprioritizing what's important. How are we ministering to people, good ministry, good music, all those types of things, so that really you are working from sort of Sunday out, not Monday through Friday, because then we as humans tend to focus on sort of more, human things, which are not terribly important. So that's a great story. Well, hopefully we'll pull you out of the pit and out of the washing machine, and everything's going to be fine. Maybe Brother Donald, you can kind of maybe share a few kind of case studies, because this is not me calling you old, but seasoned, have been many congregations, seen
Right.
many things. What are some of the things where you've seen where it's worked, and then maybe not so much?
Are you trying to say are you trying not to say someone of my vintage, which I had a younger priest say to me, someone of your vintage. That's a polite way of saying he thought I was older than God, but here we are. So what I'd love to do from a long view perspective is just a real quick set of snapshots from congregations large and small, urban and suburban, town churches, one in Maine, a Reverend, and one in Florida. I've served in very small congregations and some very favorite experiences. I've served in some larger congregations, either on staff as rector, and those are wonderful experiences too. I'll speak just a second about something Jesus said and that John reported in the gospel that we heard last Sunday. Among the things Jesus said was, if a kernel, a grain of wheat, one seed, it doesn't look like much. And if you don't do anything with it, it doesn't. But if you plant it, if you commit that seed to the ground, if you bury it, it has the potential to bear much fruit. And of course, Jesus this week and in the week to come, Holy Week, shows us what can come. Just a kernel, a seed, one idea, one person. I love to work with, in the past, present, I love to work with church wardens, officers, vestry members, especially those coming on board, people, the kind of people Dina's been speaking about, and you, Luke, and being sure that they're onboarded well and that they receive the resources they need. I have a conviction. From a longer view, I have a conviction that now is the time that people really are eager to move forward. We all remember last March, thought, oh, it can't be true that we're not going to be together on Easter Sunday. Well, maybe by Pentecost, we can do Easter Sunday and Pentecost. And fast forward, people are not only eager to be able to come back together to worship, or eager to be able to be physically present with each other for fellowship or learning or youth ministries. They're eager to move forward into God's vision. And I think that the doors are beginning to open toward those abilities and potentials. So I think it's time for Vestry to lean forward into possibility potential. There's some simple things, of course, that vestries can be led to do. As the rector or dean, the administrative staff, doing everything they can to the vestry workflow orderly and creative. For instance, in a vestry meeting, do you really lead with an extensive treasurer's report? Or can that come later in the meeting for those people who don't want to hear the treasurer's report or don't need that level of detail? When you begin spiritually, you begin with a consent agenda, you thank people for the reports that were filed 5 days in advance and everyone's read. And then as you move through, perhaps it's time for a significant treasurer's report, sometimes more lengthy than others. I really believe that we're now at the stage in the life of most congregations, large and small, that one should look at least, one should always be looking at least 3 months forward, and that every 3 months, every third vestry meeting or chapter meeting you should imagine, where do we want to be 3 months from now? Where do we want to be 12 from now? What are we able to do a year and a half from now, 18 months from now, so that there's not a sameness to every vestry meeting. The vestry meeting next month can do the work of the vestry meeting next month, but also can say, and in accord with our core values and our vision, some part of which that vision may have been put on hold because of the pandemic, some part of our vestry meeting is going to look forward 3 months toward our goals, or 6 months. And I think that's significantly important these days as we look at strengths and opportunities. What are your aspirations? What kind of results do you want? And so let me give you just a little bit of framework there, and then move into some specific case studies. Simple questions that I would ask myself before going into any vestry meeting as a lay leader or clergy person. Where do you want to be? What do you want to be? What do you want to do? What do we want to accomplish? Why do you want to do that? Why are we striving so hard to reopen, or to, in 3 months, have this accomplished? Why? The why is really important, and it has to align with your core values and your agreed upon vision statement. So where do you want to go? What's in the way? And these days, really beginning, what's along the way? I mean, there could be some really pleasant surprises as we come back together and we regain momentum and energy. What's in the way, but what's along the way? What are some opportunities that God's going to give us? What are some resources that'll fall in our laps? Maybe there's some new members who come to us as online members who are going to show up in the flesh and really be eager to get their hands into the system. So what do you want to focus on at, let's say, every third meeting or seasonally? At every third meeting, do you want to identify that being that season, we're going to talk about worship. That the next season, we're going to talk about education. The next season, we're going to talk about pastoral care. Perhaps in the fall, we'll talk about our annual giving, obviously, those sorts of things. I think also we're bound up with these days, who is new to the staff, because you probably had some staff shifts in many congregations, especially larger, have repurposed some roles. People may be doing different jobs. In congregations large and small, is there an opportunity for a new staff member, or perhaps you hired on contract a videographer or a communications person? And who's new? In some congregations, now that we can worship anywhere online, and that online presence will continue even after we're back together in the buildings substantially, are there some online-only members? And are they going to stay online-only members, or do they want to be able to come in? Or this is not uncommon, that you've got people who used to be members of the church but moved away for various reasons, but they've come back to worship or come back for learning experiences. Can they have dual citizenship? Can they be an associate member online? Do you recognize and welcome them in? Some other things I think of are, what resources do we have now that we didn't have a year ago? And almost everybody's beefed up their technology out of necessity. And there's opportunity now to continue to do that. I'd like to talk about a couple of, more than a couple, but some case statements. I think of St. John's Cathedral, Jacksonville. It's jackscathedral.org. It's a thriving congregation with a dynamic dean. Dean Kate is wonderful. She's got a good staff. They sort of re-engineered the staff a little bit. When we were beginning to work together, I was beginning to work together in the fall more than the vestry retreat. The vestry retreat, because of the pandemic, got moved from the spring to the next fall. They had some deferred maintenance issues, and this is not uncommon. I can imagine in congregations, the roof was leaking then, or the air conditioning system was on its last legs then, or there are problems with the foundation or water intrusion. And a lot of times, or not a lot of times, in many churches, a year ago, those were parked because you had to deal with the urgent. How do we have worship? How do we pivot to online? So St. John's Jacksonville really excel at a new model for Vestry retreat, all of it online, but it was sensational. It wasn't a drag. People can get such terrible Zoom fatigue that they disappeared for 2 weeks. Yet there still are some deferred maintenance issues in many congregations. And I think it's about time to begin to lean forward into the potential of meeting those. Some people have job restrictions. Some people have lower income. Some have actually done pretty well in the financial markets and may be ready to be asked to help fix the roof. I think of an urban church in Tennessee, which had a very fruitful multi-year, multifaceted campaign before the pandemic and just finished up one little bit in 2020. And that meant because they'd done all that work, were positioned for what did come in 2020, and they're positioned for their future. They'd done all of their capital campaign work. They just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And that helped them thrive through the last year and position them for the future. Another urban church in Tennessee had needs, and they borrowed from their endowment. Don't get me started on borrowing from your endowment, or if you want to hear from me, I'll be glad to tell you my opinion. They had done what they felt they had. They borrowed from their endowment because, of course, within a year, they'd pay it back because they were going to have a capital campaign. But they hit the pause button a year ago. Most of the needs for repair and maintenance still exist. So I think we're beginning to get to the point where the leadership there is going to say, the needs still exist. We need to lean forward into the future and begin to get the resources to meet those needs. A suburban church in Metro Augusta, Georgia, a year ago was about to launch or get ready to launch a capital campaign to pay off their mortgage, but they didn't hit the pause button, they hit the stop button. I'm talking about financial campaigns, capital campaigns, because they're easy to identify. We could be talking about a new outreach ministry, a new pilgrimage ministry, new pastoral care universe. Just continue with this model for a moment. I think of a church on the East Coast that went almost almost double over goal on a campaign 2 years ago to pay off the mortgage. This is a congregation close to me on the coast and close to my heart. So a couple of years before the pandemic, they mounted a capital campaign, went almost double over goal. That allowed them to take the burden and stress off the annual mission and ministry budget, the operating budget, because they didn't have to pay the mortgage out of the annual ministry budget. Lo and behold, a couple of years go by and wham, here comes the pandemic. They didn't have that mortgage stress in the budget. Giving didn't go down. We're able to hire a contract videographer for worship and other pastoral care and learning ministries, group ministries, and also hire their first part-time communications person, which they sorely needed. They were able to take care of deferred maintenance out of the bounty of the capital campaign, so that didn't impact the ministry budget. And when COVID came along, they were not stress-free, but they didn't have the relentless stress that some other congregations face. I mentioned in closing for my piece here, one church in Florida. Years ago, I, as rector, was privileged to help build and equip leadership teams of very gifted lay leaders and staff members. We moved the annual stewardship focus into the winter from the typical fall stewardship annual giving thing. We moved it in this Florida parish into the winter. Why? That's when everybody's there. This is not rocket science. Took it, the treasurer panicked in December and said, "We can't do that." And I said, "Sure, we can. Trust me. We'll get through it. Just plan for the same budget, and then after we have our annual giving in the winter, we'll move forward more robustly, and you can revise the budget upward." And lo and behold, thank God that worked. We, in the second year, had a capital campaign in Lent. It went over in Lent. And building on the success of that, we built an endowment trust. Their planned gifts giving program allowed them to grow that endowment trust into the millions. And then very differently at the other end of US 1, the Diocese of Maine, most Episcopalians in Maine are around the greater Portland area, Kennebunkport, Biddeford, and the diocese acts as a resource to minister with all of those Episcopalians in the southern part of Maine, where most are. And the diocese also sort of transfers some of those resources and shares them with congregations that are much further spread out, much smaller, some of which are heavily resourced and some are not. The furthest one, I asked the then new Bishop of Maine before Bishop Brown, I said, Bishop Steve, tell me when you leave your home on to go to the furthest congregation, what's the drive time? And he said, well, I drive up on Saturday. It takes 8 hours. I worship with the congregation that morning, have lunch with have breakfast with the vestry, and drive 8 hours home and get home for a very late dinner. And I never go in winter. You don't go to Caribou, Maine in winter driving alone. So I tell those stories because
I think general rule of thumb, any place called Caribou, only go during autumn.
I tell that because, how do we build networks? How do we build partnerships? I did a little bit of consulting with the Diocese of Toronto early on in the pandemic. And in March in the Diocese of Toronto, it's cold. They had already a year prior, having not the pandemic, determined they were going to translate a lot of their routine diocesan meetings to Zoom meetings, use the technology, and keep people off the roads in the winter. Why drive 2 or 3 hours in the winter for a 1 hour meeting and then have to get home, So the good news is they were skilled at Zoom when they needed to be skilled at Zoom. How do we capitalize on everything we've learned in the last year? How do we really share what we've learned and collaborate? And how do congregations large and small partner with each other and be resourceful together, learn from each other on best practices, share resources? And again, this could have to do with stewardship, financial stewardship. It also obviously easily do with best practices for containing, for keeping an online ministry into the future, because that's what people expect. To speak of the consortium has learned new ways to have a conference. And the conference in Atlanta next year almost certainly will be a hybrid conference. Some people are really eager to get back and have the camaraderie. And some others might say next year, well, we can bring part of our team this year, but if there's a hybrid component, perhaps we'll have part of our team join as they did this year online. I'm really excited. I'm a realist. I'm an optimist. I'm a person of hope. The realist in me says we really have to be careful. We have to be cautious. We have to care for people first and their health and well-being. But the health and well-being of the church is resilient. God's been with us through all this. Christ Jesus is growing that seed. We're going to see it at Easter as we move past Holy Week and all its richness. And I'm very excited. I think it's time for congregations and their lay leaders and clergy to move forward together, really lean into it.
Agree 1,000,000%, Donald, and glad is what I'm kind of seeing at CCS and my colleagues are seeing across the board in the nonprofit sector, not just among churches, but really across the board. We're seeing a huge resurgence in people, thinking about doing projects, thinking about sort of re-engaging to do things. So that what might have been sort of, heresy to bring up in sort of October, folks were real saying there's a want, there's a pent-up need, demand. So we're seeing that across the, across the spectrum from a number of different folks. Had a good question that came up from one of the folks who'd said, what's the ideal number of vestry members? So that way you are kind of getting consensus, you're getting different views, and it also doesn't feel anonymous either if you have a really large vestry that everybody feels. So just maybe Dina, I'll start with you, and then maybe Donald, you can kind of share your thoughts. What do you think works well?
You know, at some level, it really depends on the size of your parish and the number of folks you're going to have access to that are going to have the resources of time to do this periodically. If you're in a really large congregation, you can do 12. That would be difficult for us in our parish. Everybody here works lots, you know, we're DC folks or Baltimore folks. They're going in different directions, a lot of mostly dual career households with lots of activities going on in their kids' lives. So I think we're good to get 9. We'll never get all the views represented. And so the best thing that we can do is really manage the leadership and the leadership anxiety on behalf of God's people, and to not only shepherd the people, but to shepherd the anxiety that exists in the congregation so that we do all the stressful anxiety stuff in the meeting. And like Mary pondered that in her heart, we don't have to share all of that with everyone in the congregation. In fact, that would burden them and make them on the, you know, they're not on the vestry. That's our work. And so really learning to serve and lead in a way that removes the burden from the other folks so they can come and worship, they can come and lead a ministry, they can come and do other things. And then they'll take their turn on vestry and carry the anxiety or that burden around things, the leadership burden. So for us, 9 works. And we're at an ASA of 120-ish pre-pandemic.
And like I said, for those of you who aren't familiar with Maryland, where Dina's congregation is kind of in central Maryland, which means her folks, some of them could work, you know, about 45 minutes away in Frederick. Some could work 40 minutes away in Baltimore City. Some could work in Annapolis, where the state capital is in Maryland, which is about an hour, or DC. But because we actually have LA style traffic around Maryland, that could be a 90-minute or, you know, or more ride every day. So to her point, you have to be thoughtful about, you know, when do we have meetings and who can make it. Donald, just curious what your sort of experience has been at different congregations.
You know, I've been in a place where in congregations where 40 is a big congregation on a Sunday morning, and I've been in you know, standing room only 600, or on Sanibel in the winter, fall, winter, spring 400 in a building that's been lengthened 3 times. 9, 12 is a wonderful number, has good warrant. 15, I think over 15 gets to be a large board in any circumstance. I tell you, I do, though, under the rubric of no good deed goes unpunished, I do ask those, have asked in my own congregation, and I've shared this, and some other congregations have adopted it. If you serve faithfully on vestry, so let's say a 3-year term, I ask that I be allowed as rector, or that the vestry be allowed to continue when a vestry class retires and the wardens retire or treasurer rolls off, to stay on the mailing list of the vestry, the email list, so that they get the agenda for the next meeting, they get the minutes, they get all the financials. That because I think it's a subtle way of thanking people and saying, you're not used up. We really value you and your expertise, and you have now a perspective of at least 3 years, and you might see something on the agenda or in the financials or in the this kind of report that concerns you, alarms you, or excites you, and we want to hear. And here's the real key. When somebody comes up to a former vestry member in month 6 of, you know, having been off the vestry and says, can you tell me what that crazy new rector is doing? I mean, that sounds like they're just doing crazy, what went on with the vestry. If when a vestry member retires, they're cut off, all they can do is say, I have no idea. I'm retired, and they don't share anything.
Nobody tells me anything.
That's brilliant.
Nothing. No. Instead, they can say, well, you know, actually, I still get the agenda. I still get the minutes. I still get all the financials. And I don't always read all that stuff. I can go to the vestry meeting online if I want to, but I can tell you I've got full faith and confidence that they're not lunatics and that they're actually doing some good stuff. Well, let me look into that for you. I'll get back. It's a completely concept of inclusiveness and appreciation for, after all, a Vestry member of 3 years experience or 6 years experience has real insight and value.
Absolutely.
That is so brilliant, Donald, because then they're also keeping an eye on things, and that's transparent and lovely in its own way. It reminds me, a mentor, and I'm trying to think of who, told me to get my senior wardens together after I'd been there for a while. And so the former senior warden is in charge every June of pulling all the senior wardens that I've served with together, and they bring snacks and goodies, and we have dinner, and I just run a bunch of crazy ideas by them, and I ask them how I'm doing. And they are the ones that really know me. And so that's a little leadership circle that I love pulling together. That's one of my favorite events of the year.
That's great.
That's a great idea and a great tool for folks too. And also, if you're a new rector coming in, even having that, kind of counsel that you can lean into, that you can, learn some of that history and why things might be the way they are, why things are being done a certain way versus just trying to unpack it yourself. What a great idea.
We've had, very briefly, congregations had invited all the former Vestry members and surviving spouses, all of them, to a free lunch. And they didn't believe it. They came, but they thought they were going to get hit for them. It was, no kidding, a free lunch. All the former Vestry members and spouses and surviving spouses came to lunch, and they were at table, and they were served by the present Vestry members.
Oh, how lovely.
And we did this 3 weeks before the annual meeting. And what we did was, we would like to share with you, and the senior warden did to share with you what we're going to present at the annual meeting. And we want to introduce to you the nominees for Vestry, and you get the first crack at it. And it was unbelievable. The only thing they did at St. Paul's Augusta, they asked that we change it from a lunch to a preprandial hour and dinner the next year. They amped it up. So it became quite the thing.
Great. Well, we talked earlier about managing everybody's time. So we're getting up on the hour. So have a couple tips, maybe Caitlin, if you could pop them up. I'll run through them, but I do want to come back to each of our speakers for a quick minute here. So again, some checklists of some of the things that we heard. Be honest about the time commitment, that it isn't, it is something that is meaningful. So let's be thoughtful about that. And to Donald's point about even being sensitive to folks driving during kind of bad weather times of the year. So let's be thoughtful about that. Giving that orientation and training at the outset. I think we just learned something, a great idea from Dina, of that pulling together the folks who've been in leadership roles to kind of be a sounding board. Finding that kind of rhythm and cadence of what communication needs, both for you as sort of parish staff and vestry members, not only internally, but also to the greater congregation. Last two things, just make sure that you're setting goals and objectives that are meaningful, but are attainable. And then you're evaluating progress and success. Donald talked about how your sort of, your meetings might look like for the calendar year. Map that out. Like anything else, go back and measure them. Did we touch on those different things? And again, always be on the lookout for talent for future vestry members. Some people don't seek out the spotlight or don't seek out leadership, but it doesn't mean they wouldn't be amazing. So sort of keep your eyes and ears open out there. And if we could go back to full screen real quick minute before we wrap up. I would say, with kind of a minute to go, Dina, any kind of final wishes with Easter coming up, wishes that you'd like to have at your community?
Wishes? I have so many wishes.
Yeah.
I love these people. These are wonderful people, and I want them to be healthy, and I want them to be emotionally well and healthy, as well as free from COVID and able to process the grief that has been in our lives over COVID. So, there's nothing more as pastors than we want that. It's not about our success at fundraising at the end of the day. It's how are God's people doing? And so I'm trying to get myself out of assessment mode about what all the planning is, and just really love each other and take care of each other and take care of myself and my people, my family people as well. So that's my wish, is that we move through this and remain healthy and intact and able to serve God.
Excellent. And then Donald, as the radio guys go, we're hard up against the hour. One quick final thought for everybody. Easter coming.
Yeah, I'd start my morning every day with "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me" from Psalm 51. We've heard it lately. I'm so grateful for the lay leadership in congregations large and small. And my prayer for the lay leadership and for congregations in the coming days is as we move to and through Holy Week, and as we move through some of the pain of that, and as we leave behind one year, I really hope and pray that they are able to embrace Easter joy and to have the Spirit come afresh and really bear good fruit and be able to come back together and move forward.
Amen to that, my friends. So this has been wonderful. This has been recorded. We can share with everybody. I hope everybody has a lovely Easter. If anybody has questions, we'll share the deck, and happy to answer any questions offline. So thank you, Dina. Thank you, Donald. And thank you, Caitlin, for running the show behind the scenes. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
God bless. God bless.